Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's very first virtual book talk. My name is Alex Brubaker. I'm the manager here at the Scholar, and I am hunkered down here in Harrisburg on 3rd Street in Midtown. I hope you're all home. I hope you're safe, and I hope you're taking care of yourselves. Thank you so much for joining us as we continue to bring authors and their books to our now virtual community. We're in some uncertain times right now. It's the elephant in the room. But we really miss our event series. We miss our community, and we're hoping this virtual event series offers some sense of normalcy to our lives. So as they say, the show must go on, and we're going to fight to bring these important conversations and discussions to you for free in this virtual way. Since this is our first event, please bear with us through any technical difficulties we might have. I apologize in advance, but hopefully we'll work out any hiccups we have on the fly so you can continue to watch a seamless video stream. I do, as always, have some quick housekeeping to go over. I'll try to keep it short. First and foremost, indie bookstores and small businesses are getting hit hard by this pandemic. Midtown Scholar Bookstore is no exception. As we try to stay afloat during this difficult time, online book sales and gift cards have become of paramount importance to us and other indie bookstores. We want this event series to be sustainable for us and you, so we encourage you, whether through us or maybe even through your own local indie, please purchase Katherine and John's books. They've been really gracious in offering their time to us, so please support them, support the bookstore. We all need some good literature to read during these long days. And as a special, we are offering free domestic media mail shipping on these books through the end of March. So at any point during the video, please click the link below, and it will direct you to the Midtown Scholars website to purchase the books. It says books available for purchase. It should be green on your screen. It's just below my face. Feel free to click that at any time, and it will lead you to a landing page on Midtown Scholar Bookstore. One last plug before I introduce the authors. We are offering a special gift card deal through the end of March at our website. We'll add 10% credit value to your gift card purchase. So if you purchase a $50 gift card, we'll give you $5, and that'll make it $55. If you purchase a $100 gift card, we'll give you $10 to make it $110. What it does is it really helps us weather the storm that we're in right now, and then you, of course, reap the literary rewards later. And lastly, I just want everyone to follow this Crowdcast account, Midtown Scholar Bookstore, to stay updated on our live events that are being added every day. I can't give away any information quite yet, but there's a few authors in the works that you'll want to be alerted to. Some quick logistics about Crowdcast. Katherine Stewart and John FEA will be having a conversation for about half an hour or so. Then we'll go to audience Q&A for maybe 20 to 30 minutes or so. If at any point you have a question for the authors, please click the Ask a Question button down below. You can type out a question, and you can upvote someone's question that you'd like answered, just like on Facebook or Instagram. It's pretty straightforward, and we'll try to get to as many questions at the end of the event. Unfortunately, we can't promise we'll get to all of them. But please do not use the chat room to the right to ask questions to the authors, as we will not be able to see it. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers here this evening. John FEA is Professor of American History at Messiah College. His previous books include Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? A Historical Introduction, and of course, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump. Here it is. He blogs regularly at The Way of Improvement Leads Home, and you can reach that at www.thewayofImprovement.com. If you are not following John's blog, I highly encourage you to do so. You will not be disappointed. Katherine Stewart's work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, American Prospect, The Atlantic, and other publications. She's the author of The Good News Club. Again, we have this book available for purchase as well, which is an investigation of the religious right and public education. Her new book, which we are here for this evening, is titled The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. It has received rave reviews from multiple media outlets and authors, and we're very thankful to Katherine for joining us tonight. At this time, I'll do what I do best, and that's get out of the way. So take it away, Katherine and John.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you so much for John. I'm so grateful to be here, and especially grateful to Midtown Scholar Bookstore. It's more important than ever to support independent booksellers And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to be Midtown Scholars guinea pig along with John. So the main theme of my book is that what pretends to be a religious movement is in fact a political movement. And nationalist religion is inherently anti-democratic and tends toward authoritarianism. So my book is a deep dive into the inner workings and leading personalities of this movement that has used religion as a tool for political power. I'm excited to be in conversation with John, whose wonderful book, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump, is an important part of my research and that of so many others. I'm going to let you, John, direct the conversation.
Yeah, sure. So I think, first of all, it's great to have this conversation with you. I've been following the kind of rise of this book, Catherine, and as someone who has been studying sort of this Christian right, Christian nationalist movement for a while, very few reporters often get it, but your book definitely gets it. And so I was really excited to be able to interview you and have this conversation. So I hope all of you out there in crowdsource land are going to be educated and informed by this discussion. So let's start with the basics. Christian nationalism. As Alex said, I wrote a book about 9 years ago about this idea that America was a Christian nation. It was largely a historical treatment, right? But that word was not as significant back in sort of 2010, 2011. You didn't hear it as much. You're hearing it a lot more now. So how do you define this idea of Christian nationalism? What is it?
Well, the first thing to know is that it's not a religion. It's a political ideology.
Yeah.
Its representatives insist that the foundation of legitimate government in the United States is bound up inextricably with a particular reactionary understanding of a particular religion. And it basically says that the United States is founded on the Bible and can succeed only if it remains true to this foundation. It's also a device, a very effective device for mobilizing and often manipulating a large section of the American public, and for concentrating power in the hands of a new elite. I want to say something else about what it's not.
Yeah.
It's not about just evangelicals. As you know, the movement includes many evangelicals, but it also excludes many evangelicals. And it includes a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant forms of religion. What unites the movement is really not a distinct theology, but more of a political vision.
So I'm glad you make that distinction, because I think there's a lot of, whether it be the press or, maybe people on the left who, or, people who are secular who conflate the two, right? They that all evangelicals are somehow Christian nationalists. And I think the fact that, 81% of conservative evangelicals, right, voted for Trump, if those statistics are true.
Right. White evangelicals voted for Trump, 81%, but, about 1 in 5 didn't.
Yeah.
And many, if not most, evangelicals of color did not vote for Trump, although some number did, of course.
Yeah.
So the religion is really, what unites the movement is really not sort of its religion, sort of denomination. It's really more of a common political ideology.
But don't many evangelicals actually see it as a religious movement, the evangelicals themselves?
Yes, of course. What you actually see is political action. They might call religion, but it's also worth pointing out that members of the movement reserve some of their most poisonous words for Christians to dare identify as a different sort. Yeah. So many Christians, many evangelical Christians, are opposed to the politics of conquest and division that this movement represents, and large numbers of them question whether it is even Christian in the first place.
Sure. Yeah, I do think there's this long history of kind of in American evangelicalism of kind of, conflating the government and, somehow we're a Christian nation, and that's a spiritual thing too. So I'm glad that you sort of parsed that out. One of the things I love about your book, Catherine, is all these biographical sketches, right? These vignettes, right? You're a reporter, so you're often talking about what they're wearing, and I love that kind of stuff. What they look like, what the rooms look like where you attend these various events. Let's start with one of these biographical sketch, and largely because if you follow religion news, this guy was in the news today. He said that the coronavirus was some kind of a judgment from God. This is this man who leads a Bible study with Trump's cabinet, Ralph Drollinger. Who is this guy? And tell us a little bit about how this man's life or his ministry kind of feeds into this idea of the evangelical, or at least the Christian nationalist, let's say, pursuit of power.
Right. Ralph Drollinger is the founder of a group called Capital Ministries, and he targets leaders at the highest echelons of political power. If you look at the Capital Ministries website, a dozen current and former members of Trump's cabinet are listed as cabinet sponsors and attend or have attended his weekly Bible study in the nation's capital. Drollinger also has Bible study groups targeting the House of Representatives and the Senate and various state houses. And he is conducting a form of shadow diplomacy with political leaders around the world. So I would say that he is arguably one of the most politically influential pastors in America today. So if you look at the expansiveness on his positions in domestic policy, foreign policy, economic policy, this really hits home the fact that Christian nationalism is a political movement and not a stance on the so-called culture wars. I mean, he promotes the idea that social welfare programs have no basis in scripture. He's an ardent male supremacist who argues that God wants women to be subordinate in church at home because clearly he knows what God wants. He says, might not be what I want, but it's what God wants. He is against progressive income taxes, has a theology of taxation that unabashedly favors the rich. He writes that God believes in deregulation and laborers in the workforce should submit to their bosses. He calls environmentalism something like a false religion. So he thinks environmental regulation, sort of like regulation of businesses, and argues that it should be, very minimal. So he's a really interesting character. His theology is kind of music to the ears of the plutocratic funders of the movement, many of whom rely on minimal workers' rights and economic and environmental deregulation in order to maintain and increase their profits. And it does also reflect the movement's general, longstanding alliance with moneyed interests and hostility to the notion of social and economic equality. And as we know, this is precisely the exact opposite interpretation of the Christian religion that many American Christians understand it.
And who are some of the people that attend his Bible study? Because I'm assuming, right, he's using these all those things you just mentioned. He has biblical justification for. So who is he influencing on a daily basis? Or weekly basis, yeah.
If you look at his website, I just checked the other day, he's got a list of cabinet sponsors. It includes, and they're on his website, happily, apparently, and Betsy DeVos, Alex Azar is on there, Mike Pence is on there, Pompeo's on there, Bridenstine is on there, a number of others. So, he's Purdue.
Studied Purdue.
Purdue, who's the head of the agriculture department. So,
and he's a fascinating guy. I mean, if any sports fans out there, I mean, this guy, I think he was like the backup center to Bill Walton on the old UCLA teams. He's like 7'2", I think. Yeah. And you talk about him being a kind of masculine presence. I mean, he is this sort of huge guy who's sort of thundering down, right? These kind of biblical ideas. That's the image I got when I read that chapter.
What's really interesting about him is that he did a lot of his theological training at the master's ceremony, master's seminary, which was led by John MacArthur, who is himself an incredibly ardent supremacist, for one thing. When I had interviewed somebody who worked at the master's seminary for nearly a quarter decade, who said that if you're if your wife worked, he'd fire you, or if he liked you, he'd give you a raise so your wife could quit her job. And I might be mispronouncing her name, Etta Leninger. She's a famous and really well-regarded theologian. She was from Germany, and she was making a rare visit to the United States. And one of the professors, I think, had a connection with her and thought, wow, I could get her to come speak on campus. And she wasn't given a space on campus. She was compelled to meet with students off campus because MacArthur was so hostile to the idea of a woman sort of teaching men. So that
and MacArthur for a long time has been sort of one of the leading advocates of this, complementarianism, they call it, approach. Katherine, there's so much I want to ask you, but let's switch to another topic. We could stay on Drollinger all day. Now, when most people think about the Christian right, say, or Christian nationalism as a political movement, abortion, right, is usually at the top of the list. And I would probably argue, even to this day, abortion is still probably, the number one, if not near the top, kind of political issue here with Supreme Court justices and so forth. But I want to read carefully, make sure you get it right. Make sure I get this right. Chapter 3 of your book is entitled "Inventing Abortion." And early in that chapter, you say the abortion issue has never been just about abortion. And you draw here, too, from some of the scholarship of Randall Balmer, the Dartmouth religion professor. But what do you mean by that? Abortion is not really about abortion when it comes to these Christian nationalists. Unpack that for us.
When the leaders of the movement are talking to the rank and file, or when they're talking to pastors about the messages that they should give to their congregants in order to get them to turn out the vote for their so-called biblical issues, it's all abortion all the time. Abortion is the beginning and the end. But and they promote this idea that their movement was a grassroots reaction to abortion. But any student of power knows that the key to controlling the present is controlling the past. So they've promoted this narrative that it's all about abortion, and it's really not. I mean, if you look a couple decades ago, there's this fascinating episode that Randall Balmer describes, where leaders of what would become the religious right, they were part of this intellectual movement called the New Right. They got together and basically went down a laundry list of the issues that they thought might unite their movement. And we're talking about 1980 or so, actually 40 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Years after Roe v. Wade, really quite a long time ago. And but this was after Roe v. Wade. Abortion was number 5 on the list, and 4 or 5. And the issue that really motivated them was the tax treatment of racially segregated academies. They were really upset that Bob Jones's racially segregated academy might lose its tax status. They found this absolutely outrageous. But they knew that this wouldn't be an issue that was going to be really successful in uniting the movement. So they went down the list and they looked at the ERA, and that was sort of going down in flames. They looked at some other issues. And then they came down to abortion, which was number 5 or 6 on the list. And they said, wow, that could work. So many conservative-leaning Americans have been persuaded over time that abortion is the single most important issue when it comes to their vote. Now, I think we should look at the over time piece of this. When Roe v. Wade was passed, the Southern Baptist Convention, they had a publication, they hailed the decision. They called it like a sensible middle ground. Most American Protestant Republicans supported some form of liberalization of abortion laws. Barry Goldwater, that great conservative hero, supported liberalization, at least early in his career. His wife, Peggy, was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood in Arizona. I was really astonished to discover that. Can you imagine the wife of like a male Republican politician doing that today? Oh my gosh. Billy Graham himself said in 1968, he said, I would disagree with a Catholic stance. He said, I believe in Planned Parenthood. Billy Graham said that. But, over time, pro-choice voices were purged from the Republican Party. There's sort of pro-life religion that we see today in the Republican Party is a modern creation, and it was for political purposes.
Yeah, the fascinating history of that too is that, and I think Balmer talks a little bit about this too. He has this wonderful chapter in his book on, I can't remember the subtitle, the title, like An Evangelical's Lament is the subtitle. And he talks about where are all the Baptists? And one of the reasons Southern Baptists rejected it is because they believed in the separation of church and state, right? They didn't want government interfering in the personal lives, the personal decisions of in this case, women. So it's amazing the change over time, right, that has taken place, especially since the conservative movement got a hold of the Southern Baptist Church. And then Ronald Reagan, right, was a pro-choice governor of California.
That's true. I mean, I think for many Republican Protestants, it accorded with their idea of middle-class morality and social responsibility. The idea that people should be allowed to have the number of children that they feel like they can raise responsibly, and it was sort of viewed in that context.
Let me try to kind of nuance this a little bit, maybe for some listeners. So you could be like, so what is your take on this? Could you be kind of pro-life on the abortion question? Because you hear a lot of pro-life people also saying kind of we're pro-life from, the womb to death, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the abortion issue, right? Could you be pro-life on abortion, maybe even attend the March for Life, which you have great coverage of in the book, and not be a Christian nationalist, right? Parse that out for me.
Of course. I mean, you can take that view or any number of nuanced views on this particular issue and still support democracy and not be a Christian nationalist. But what you need to understand is that if this is the one issue that decides your vote, you end up supporting a Christian nationalist agenda. And, leaders of the movement understand very well that if they can get people to vote on a single issue or just a couple issues, they can capture their vote. So when, again, when movement leaders are talking to the rank and file, abortion is, really the issue that they seek to hit home. And we have to remember that a lot of people they may not think of themselves as Christian nationalists, but they've been persuaded through this incredible media and messaging machine that abortion is this sort of issue, and there's very sophisticated framing. I mean, when I attend these, not just the Marches for Life, but also the conferences that take place around the Marches for Life, they have really incredibly targeted and segmented messaging workshops, some for seniors, some for families and parents, and others for kids, teens, college students, in order to sort of respond to the issues of the time. So I spoke to this one young woman who's active in the anti-abortion movement at the university level, and she said, what I tell them is, let's see if I can remember this exactly. She said something like, I tell them it's discrimination against their age. And that's a message that resonates really well with my generation, because we're all about equal rights for everybody and anti-discrimination. So they really respond to the messages of the moment.
Another one of these, thank you. Another one of these sketches, biographical sort of vignettes. You spent some time with this man. Am I getting his name right? Jim Doman, is that correct? Doman.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, right? He was he was. Did he? I don't know if he went through, I don't think he went through conversion therapy, but he was gay. He kind of had a conversion to evangelical Christianity and became straight as a result of the conversion. He's Hispanic. He rallies.
He's right. He just does work with a lot of other.
Oh, he's not. Okay. So he works with Hispanic evangelicals. So tell me about this guy, but also tell me about, you spent some time with sort of a lot of Hispanic evangelicals who support Trump. And you would define as kind of embracing this Christian nationalist idea. What was that like?
Really interesting. I think Roman's story is a really interesting one for anybody who wants to understand the movement. He's, as you mentioned, he's a pastor. He calls himself a former homosexual, lives in Orange County, California. And he founded a group called Church United, which organizes dozens of events every year that encourage pastors throughout the state of California to engage in politics at the local and national level. He also gets pastors together, large numbers of pastors, for these free annual tours of the state capitol in Sacramento. He takes them to Washington, D.C., where they meet important and very politically connected movement leaders. So, and he has events throughout the state, getting pastors together and giving them the messages and tools that they need to communicate to their congregations the issues that they need to, upon which to base their vote. So, it's essentially a voter outreach machine working through pastors. Yeah. But Doman's Church United group is also built around, explicitly around the idea of racial inclusiveness. So here's how it works. Like Watchmen on the Wall, you know what Watchmen on the Wall is. Initiative.
Tell us what it is, though. Yeah, for those who don't.
Okay, one of the leading policy groups of the religious right is the Family Research Council, and they have one initiative called Watchmen on the Wall that they have something like 29,000 affiliated pastors. They get them together, they give them tools to get out, to turn out their congregations to vote for certain candidates, get their congregations to vote their biblical values. So Church United is like that, but focusing on the state of California. A substantial number of Church United's gatherings are conducted in the Spanish language. So Jim Doman, who I'd written about previously, invited me to attend one, and I went. So, he knew I was an opposition journalist and still reached out, which is very generous, very interesting. So there I was in a Chula Vista megachurch surrounded by dozens of Latino pastors. And the speaker said, when you're talking with your congregations about these issues, what's more important, talking about the minimum wage or life? So they're really trying to tell people like, yeah, of course, your congregations might be worried about, are they going to make their bills this month? But really, life is more important,
As if minimum wage and life are complete binary things, right?
I know.
Yeah.
But, get the pastors on board with these, the supposedly correct culture war issues. And through them, they capture some subsection of their congregants' votes. So I think, Doman's initiative points to some really interesting racial dynamics of the movement. The movement is often characterized as a white movement. And I think for a lot of people in the rank and file, a lot of the white people, it really is an implicitly white movement. It's part of the vision for them of recovering a nation that was once supposedly Christian and white. And furthermore, the movement drives support for a political party that has made race-based gerrymandering and voter suppression a sort of strategic imperative. And Trump, as we know, also appeals to the racism of many of his followers. So I'm not letting them off the hook here, but the leaders of the movement like Doman or Tony Perkins or Ralph Reed, they can read the demographic future as clearly as you or I can. And they understand very well that if their movement is to survive in the future or succeed in certain districts, they need to draw in some number of voters of color, some percentage of those voters in those districts. And they also recognize, I think, in ways that a lot of progressives don't, that some of the fastest growing varieties of evangelicalism are in the charismatic and Pentecostal vein, and these are explicitly multiracial movements. So these leaders are making a conscious effort to include and sort of empower non-white individuals and groups in certain contexts. And at the very least, they're really doing what they can to collect those numbers of votes. But it doesn't let the movement off the hook. I mean, I think folks like Doman and Ralph Reed really do paper over the ways in which hyper-conservative religion and racism can reinforce one another.
Yeah, Perkins was just on. Perkins just interviewed yesterday, I think, had a meet. I don't know if you saw that, 700 pastors. I did a blog post about it in which Trump interviewed Trump, and this is the interview where Trump said November 3rd could be the greatest day in the history of religion. Right? If he gets elected. Why? Just real quick follow up. Why would Hispanics why is Christian nationalism appealing to Hispanics? I understand the Reeds and the Perkins and the Domans of the world, but why would people be drawn to this in the Hispanic community?
Well, obviously the Hispanic community is incredibly diverse, just as every other community is. So they're really targeting conservative leaning Latino pastors in these events who tend to take sort of conservative positions in those sort of so-called culture war issues. here's another thing. They, they talk about the sort of, threat of homosexual agenda and all this other nonsense, abortion is a big issue. They also distributed a one-page sheet, and they said, and it had like all these graphics and text, and they said, look, people, this is coming to your kids' public school. Be very afraid. It's terrible. So I looked at the sheet, and gosh, I wish I had it in front of me. It was bizarre. I mean, the material was weird. Look, I've got 2 school-age kids, and I was like, I don't want my kids learning this stuff. Is this really happening in public schools? It was really, seemed, a lot of it seemed age inappropriate, and some of the graphics just seemed downright weird. But, there's some murmurs throughout the crowd, and everybody's really worried. And you can see that, for a lot of parents are like, concerned about this. So I called the head of, I thought, okay, what's the most progressive public school district in California? It's probably San Francisco. I called the head of a, San Francisco United, school district. And I was like, are these things taught in the public schools? And there was nothing on the sheet that was taught in the way that it was, that the sheet suggested. Some of the materials that were supposedly being taught at the kindergarten or first grade, second grade level are taught at the high school level. So it's appropriate, but not, the sheet suggests that like you're, teaching kindergartens this material. And there was other stuff on other pieces of the text and graphics were not grouped together, which makes them look weird. But if you take them apart and you study this one at the high school level, it's like, well, okay, that's reasonable. And then the graphic doesn't appear anywhere and isn't taught anywhere in the district. So it was a really misleading piece of information. And then on the other side of the sheet, there was a list of all these politicians who support the Healthy Youth Act, which they want all these folks to tell their people to vote against. And all but one of them, or all but 2 of them, like 70 names, maybe all but 1 or 2 are Democrats. So it's not that people in the rank and file always know that they're supporting a much larger political agenda that is making, for instance, the separation of families and this horrible thing that they were doing with children, isolating children from their families. That's part of their policy. They think, oh my gosh, I want to protect my kids in their public school. So if you can get the right messaging out to people, they'll end up supporting an agenda that has a much broader vision than they may realize.
And, just my take too on this is a lot of this is kind of, so much anti-intellectualism within the evangelical community, right? I mean, we in some ways, speaking as an evangelical myself, we've kind of failed to create kind of critical thinkers. And I'm going to get in trouble for that from my fellow evangelicals. But, many evangelicals say, especially older evangelicals, will just kind of, take Fox News at its word or some of these organizations. But to their credit, politically, at least, these people like Perkins and Ralph Reed have built up such a trust that's hard to sort of penetrate sometimes. Let's shift gears here a little bit. So you introduce us. So, scholars have been talking about this guy for a while, but not many people probably have ever heard of Rousas Rushdoony. Really, interesting name, almost sinister, this guy Rushdoony who's, but he's this kind of, I don't know what you would even call him, a kind of theologian, who many scholars have pointed to him being kind of if you could call him an intellectual, kind of behind this idea of Christian nationalism. And just let me pause here and say, when I first started studying this stuff, I always saw Rushdoony as kind of a fringe kind of character, and I was like, people aren't really following this guy. Maybe he's influenced Jerry Falwell through this character named Francis Schaeffer, who you write about, but, he's not that significant. I'm starting to change my thinking about that, especially in the last 3 or 4 years. So who is Rushdoony? And what role does he have to play in all of this? He's since passed, I believe, right? But what who is he and what influence has he had? Where do we see his reach kind of extending in this Christian nationalist movement?
He was a mid-century theologian and an incredibly prolific writer. The main thing to know about Rushdoony is that he was intensely hostile to the principle of equality. He endorsed an austere biblical literalism, rigid hierarchies, which he asserted were ordained by God. In his view, the 14th Amendment, which includes a guarantee that all citizens receive equal protection under the law, was the beginning of the court's recession from its conception of America as a so-called Christian country. He saw it as his job to rescue America from its commitment to what he calls godless secularism. And his theology also included an opposition to government assistance to the poor and the hollowing of the social, he wants a hollowing out of the social safety net. And he casts social welfare programs as slavery to the state. Mm-hmm. So he shares much with Christian nationalists of today, the idea that America is a redeemer nation chosen by God, that it should be an Orthodox Christian republic in which women are subservient to men, of course. Education is in the hands of conservative Christians. He abhorred public schools, so much to say about that. He thought that no one really should be paying taxes to support the poor, that at some point, America has deviated horribly from its mission and fallen under the control of atheist and or liberal elites. I mean, this is the life of his thought, and it's the lifeblood of the sort of Christian nationalist idea. And, it remains a cornerstone of the movement, even as many of his successors sort of forgot about his contributions, his theological contributions to the effort, and or simply even forgot about the origins of their interpretation to the creed. I mean, I think it's really important to note that a lot of people are a little bit frightened by some of his more extreme ideas. A lot of the Christian nationalists of today, or many theologians, he advocated that, people who are like practicing witchcraft or blasphemers or adulterers should be worthy of the death penalty. But his ideas are, David Barton, who's like, I call him the Where's Waldo of the Christian nationalist movement.
You say that in the book too, yeah.
Up everywhere. I mean, Project Blitz. He's taking politicians on tours the nation's capital. He's, working the Texas State Board of Education, advisory on textbook curricula. He's absolutely everywhere. He quotes David Barton quotes David Rushdoony in some of his papers. He found the other day a paper that Family Research Council's Watchmen on the Wall, they cited Rushdoony. So he's not forgotten. They're just kind of keeping him. But it's really the idea that his ideas that are really what live on. I mean, according to him, America's founders did not intend to establish a non-sectarian representative democracy. He actually characterized the American political system as a development of Christian feudalism. He thought this is really what we should have. And he thought, here's something he said that you hear all the time, all the time from Christian nationalists. He said, the First Amendment was to establish freedom from religion, but not for religion. You're hearing this phrase widely parroted today. And it's sort of become an article of faith among a lot of the rank and file.
Yeah. So what would you kind of touched on this a little bit. Here comes Alex. Yeah.
Sorry, just heads up. We'll do like maybe 5 more minutes, and then we've got some really good questions accumulating. So then we'll get to them.
I'll tell you what. Let's. Did we lose Katherine?
No, I'm here.
She's here.
Okay. Let me do this then. I was going to ask you a follow up on Rushdoony, but let me ask one more question, and then we can move. Because I want to. Q&A is always fun on these topics. There's a lot I could ask you here, Katherine. I wanted to ask you about the Museum of the Bible, Project Blitz. You talk about you have a chapter on Betsy DeVos, the whole concept of religious liberty. So get the book. There's so much more here to cover. And again, Katherine does a great job of kind of getting at the grassroots of a lot of these movements. But at the end of your book, in your epilogue, you say this, and we'll end with this and then go to questions. You say, quote, in some ways, Christian nationalism is the fruit of a society that has not yet lived up to the promise of the American idea. What do you mean by that? And why end the book that way?
Well, the root of this kind of religious nationalism is specifically, I think, a failure to live up to the ideal of freedom and equality for all. I mean, when you have massive inequality, as we have now, two things happen. You create a population with a considerable amount of resentment and anxiety, and you also create a sort of moneyed elite that needs a way to manipulate disempowered masses. And this is what religious nationalisms have done throughout history. Now, this is not to say that all people who are very wealthy support the movement. Many don't, and many are devoting their resources to oppose it. But there is a certain, the movement has relied and continues to rely on the donations of a certain number, a number of plutocrat, a certain amount of plutocratic wealth in order to, that's one of the sources of its funding. And it's sort of allied with those interests, as we discussed earlier when we talk about what Ralph Drollinger endorses in his policy proposals. And so I think until we live up to the promise of America, we are going to still see movements of this type. This movement will have traction.
Yeah, good. Well, I think we'll leave it at that, Alex. Do we have some questions?
Yes, we've got some great questions. Our audience did not let us down. So I'm just going to, John, and you can feel free to jump in with these questions as well. John
Sure.
and Catherine, feel free to jump in.
I'll just let Catherine take them, and if I have anything to add, I'll just throw it in. Yeah,
and if you want to read the question along with me, you can click the Ask a Question button down below. Okay. But otherwise, I'll just run through them. First, from Frank, is it the goal of Christian nationalism to dismantle our separation of church and state?
Yeah, Frank, yes, it is the goal. They are always talking about, they intend to chip away at the separation of church and state in all of these different ways. The movement gets a lot of its strategic direction from the courts. They've always been very focused on the courts. Last I checked, there were 192 Trump appointees to the federal courts. That's over 22% of the federal judiciary. And, they've always been about picking the right cases to the right courts in order to dismantle the separation of church and state.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what a lot of the agenda is, certainly, and I think it's kind of a nuanced way of doing it, but the idea is that we want to reclaim, restore, renew America to its supposed Christian roots. Yeah. Yeah. Although they wouldn't say that, right, Catherine, they wouldn't say we're trying to dismantle the separation of church and state. They would just sort of redefine, as you mentioned before, they would redefine the understanding of the First Amendment in like a different way, right? Freedom from religion, right? I don't think they'd ever say that. Well, they probably would. They would say, right, we don't want the separation of church and state. It's a myth. It's a myth. Yeah.
They do. I mean, it depends on the forum. I mean, when you listen to what they say to the general public is one thing. When you go to the forums that they share, when you listen to what they're saying to their political allies and plutocratic funders, they say something else.
Exactly.
I mean, look at an initiative like Project Blitz, for instance, which is a kind of it's an initiative targeting state legislatures, flooding state legislatures with multiple identical or near identical bills, all intended to promote a sort of fusion of the idea of church and state, insert a certain form of religion into public life in much more sort of obvious ways. You can see that that's a kind of like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I was going to ask you about Project Blitz, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
This next question is from Tyler. I think understanding the term evangelical is incredibly important in this conversation. Could the two of you give us your definition of this term as you use it in your scholarship? Is it based on denomination, worldview, something else?
Go ahead, Catherine.
I'm going to start, and then I'm going to let you finish.
Yeah.
So I I think that evangelicalism is really diverse, and it includes just a lot of different theologies and different political positions. I do want to mention that there is a large and very determined movement of progressive evangelicals who, again, oppose this politics of conquest and division. And many of them question whether Christian nationalism is even sort of Christian at all in the first place. But anyway, John, you're the
Well, it depends how you want to approach this. I mean, if I were to answer this as a historian of evangelicalism, you could answer it as a kind of theological religious movement. You could also define evangelicalism as a social movement, a political movement. But I think what unites evangelicals, I would still argue, is a kind of common theological belief in, this is the famous Bebbington quadrilateral. We scholars call it. This historian David Bebbington said evangelicals are defined by four things: crucicentrism, the cross, conversion, born again kind of experience, the authority of the Bible, the inspiration, sometimes the inerrancy of the Bible. The Bible was without errors, and then some kind of an activism, an evangelism, preaching the gospel, and so forth. And you see in American history evangelicals who have been had those beliefs and been opposed to slavery and been pro-slavery, right? Katherine talks about some of the pro-slavery in my book. You see them being on all sides of the political issues. You see them, doing all kinds of different things, but I think they're united around these kinds of core theological, religious principles, right? And then they, as Katherine just said, they're very diverse in all of the other things. But an evangelical, I think, is someone who believes those things, that it transcends a particular denomination, right? So you could have evangelicals in all kinds of Protestant and even some Catholic Protestant denominations, and even some in the Catholic Church. But that's a whole other podcast, or discussion. Yeah.
This next question is from Don. Don says, how much of an influence, in your opinion, has Mike Pence had on Trump's politics? Pence is an extreme amplifier of Trump, and curious if you think he is a major force in molding many of Trump's messages.
It's interesting. Tony Perkins said that there were three incidents that really solidified the evangelical support for Trump. The first was, and I was at this meeting, it was a Road to Majority conference in Washington, D.C. That's Ralph Reed's big conference. And they brought Trump out on stage, and he said, I am going to appoint Supreme Court justices from this list. And he held up this list like it was a bunch of shiny new bonds. And he said, every single one of these judges is pro-life. Now, obviously, it's not just that they were pro-life. They were sort of right wing in a certain way, but that was like the first issue. Picking Mike Pence as his VP was the second issue that Tony Perkins pointed toward, and the third one, I believe it was there was this very large event in New York City where Trump sort of spoke to, I believe it was over 1,000 evangelical leaders, sort of, prostrated himself, I suppose. Because, early in the, 2016, before it was absolutely clear that Trump was going to be the guy, there were some leaders who really preferred Ted Cruz and had a hard time getting behind Trump. But here's the thing that the movement is so good at. They really know that they're going to succeed if they're united. And so once it was clear that he was the guy, they were all in for him. And they they have developed all of these like incredibly sophisticated tools of modern campaign infrastructure, data, media messaging. I remember Ralph Reed's, talking about the amount, like vast amounts of money and vast numbers of people, who are going to knock on the doors and things like that he was going to bring to bear in the 2016 election. They really went all in for him, and his choice of Mike Pence was a very big part of that.
I don't know what kind of influence Mike Pence has had on Trump in terms of his own kind of faith and policies, but it was certainly very strategic. It was actually a somewhat brilliant political move, because Pence has deep roots in the conservative evangelical movement, Christian right, Christian nationalist movement. He speaks the language, Pence. And, even today, or yesterday maybe, I was watching him at one of these coronavirus press conferences, and he ends his speech by saying, if we follow what Donald Trump is doing, if we follow what the public officials and Tony Fauci are doing, we will, quote unquote, heal this land. It's code. It's quoting 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people who are called by my name, I have it up here, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. And most evangelicals know exactly what Pence is doing, and he's very good at it. So I think it's definitely helped him. Pence has definitely helped Trump.
This next question is from Sharon. What do you read into Trump wanting to open up most of the country from the ongoing coronavirus restrictions starting on Easter Sunday, a nod to the religious right and his most vocal base?
Wow, there's so much to unpack here. I mean, let's start with the fact that this is a movement that has been deeply anti-science, expressed hostility to critical thinking for a very long time, and it's committed, in many instances, to frankly unscientific positions. I think the movement does bear some responsibility for the ineptitude of our response from the federal government a couple months ago, when they should have been sourcing masks and equipment and ventilators and things like that. What was happening? Instead of actually, meeting the challenge head on, you had folks like Jerry Falwell Jr. saying this is, casting this as an attack on Trump by his political enemies. It's like they take a kind of all politics all the time. Everything
and Kim Jong-un, yeah.
Pardon me?
And Kim Jong-un was behind this, yeah.
Exactly. Instead of actually looking at this challenge from a scientific way and listening to the experts and listening to what they need and trying to help them get the tools that they need to protect the public and to protect themselves. So
the Easter Sunday. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish. The Easter Sunday is to me just a blatant attempt to kind of appeal to the evangelical base. He in that one interview he said, this is a special time for me, and so forth. I did a post where I said I think Trump just prophesied his own resurrection, right? His own political resurrection on Easter Sunday. But it's clearly, the way he's framing it is clearly a political appeal.
Yeah.
But I also agree with everything Catherine said, too, about the anti-science.
This next question is from Diane. Diane says, understanding that this is about political power, can you speak more about the issue of Christian leaders ignoring behavior by a president that is not that advocated by Christ, in parentheses, lying, misleading, not treating others with respect? How is it that so many rank and file congregation members seem to be able to ignore this?
I think, some people think it's transactional. They think he's going to, appoint judges that are favorable to their interests, or he's going to enact economic policies favorable to their pocketbooks and things like that. But it goes beyond that. I don't think you can explain the devotion to Trump, almost like a cult-like devotion, in purely transactional terms. And it points to the fact that this is an anti-democratic movement. It's much more authoritarian, and Trump is a much more authoritarian leader. He doesn't follow the rules. He's not a nice guy. He breaks the rules and cracks heads, and they're fine with that as long as those heads belong to their enemies. He is sort of plays into this movement that casts itself as engaged in a struggle between absolute good and absolute evil, and doesn't just want a seat at the table in the noisy form of American democracy. They want to sort of smash the table and replace it with a different kind of order. So, he's an authoritarian. He's got a much more sort of tough guy authoritarian style. And I think, there's something about this movement that really longs for the hard hand of the despot, I think something that religious nationalists do, by the way, I just want to mention around the world, if you look at leaders like Orban in Hungary, in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Putin in Russia, when they bind themselves tightly to religious conservatives in their country in order to sort of solidify a more authoritarian form of political power, we rightly recognize this as a form of religious nationalism. And that's what we're seeing with Trump's alliances with our own religious hyper-conservatives.
Yeah, I think whenever I talk to evangelical Trump voters, they often say, "Well, who was I supposed to vote for?" Right? I always say that evangelical Christians, or Christians generally, are not supposed to hate, but evangelicals do hate. Many of them, at least, do hate Hillary Clinton, and so I think that they're like, "Well, who were we supposed to choose?" And look, I disagree with that approach, but but I'll let them off the hook at least, right, on that, for the moment. What I don't understand is, the role of the church in society is, one of the roles is to speak truth to power. Whether or not you voted for the guy or not, you speak truth to power. And I think the evangelical church, and I say this as an evangelical, this is my tribe, has been woefully irresponsible in remaining silent as Trump does all of these things that the person who asked the question raised. So I'll just leave it at that. I expound on this a little bit further in my book, Believe Me, so you can pick that up. Little plug.
All right, John, this next question is going to come from our good friend Pete Powers, so hang on tight.
My dean. Yeah.
So Pete says, I wonder about the degree to which this version of Christian nationalism has mushroomed in part in response to the vacuum of other powerful or plausible or transcendent notions of what it means to be a nation or a people. For example, so much of neoliberalism has had little more to say than basically, and I quote, "It's the economy, stupid," and not really provided any more compelling vision of what it means to be a human being or to be a citizen. In such a vacuum, various versions of extreme ideologies flourish.
Well,
this is my boss, Catherine, so you better take it. I want to keep my job.
Okay. Some people say, nationalism promotes this sort of fiction. Why, this story, why don't we promote a better story? And look, I think you can't blame others. The stories are out there and they're amazing. I mean, there are incredible stories about meaning and worth and love of all kinds and care. But progressives do not have access to the money and the media machine that the Christian nationalists do in promoting the kinds of messaging that they do to, directly to their folks. So I don't think you can blame others, who have, look, there are plenty of incredibly heroic stories about America's founding that are not Christian nationalist stories. There are incredible historians out there. We have the facts themselves are quite stunning, but to blame others for failing to get their messaging out to a group that is sort of increasingly operating in a kind of propaganda bubble, is not really. It's not. It's looking, I think, at the wrong causes.
Yeah, maybe Pete and I could talk about this over coffee when we actually see each other face to face again. Who knows when? But yeah, I agree with you, Pete. I think it's a crisis of some kind of like a robust pluralism that much of this Christian nationalism rejects. I think it's a failure of democratic citizenship. It's a failure of a kind of I think we have the rights, the idea of individual rights down pretty well in this country. And I think, if anything, what I hope and pray that this whole coronavirus thing does is teach us that citizenship requires a certain degree of duty and obligation as well to others. So, in that sense, I think there's a lot of really good resources within the Christian tradition to be able to create good citizens in a pluralistic society. But that's not the way the history has played out. And in some ways, evangelicals have been deeply captive by a kind of political playbook that emerged in the 70s and 80s, as Katherine writes about in her book, and has held a grip on the movement ever since.
I do want to point out, by the way, that I think the movement bears some responsibility for the fact that we really don't have the collective infrastructure to properly meet a crisis like the coronavirus. The movement has allied itself for decades with a kind of libertarian, pro-corporate, economic, conservative wing of the Republican Party. And so so they support politicians and policy that have privatized the healthcare system, hollowed out the social safety net. And they're constantly demonizing government. We see this since some of the pro-slavery theologians. We see it in Rushdoony. We see it in the mid-century folks like Fifield. We see this happening among movement leaders today, where they think the government should not be providing aid to people directly. It should, in some instances, be funneled through the church. This is something that somebody like Drollinger emphasizes over and over. And so, this is one of the enormous reasons. This is a kind of lack of care, for the general population. That is, I think, is a persuasive story for those of us who really care about our democracy and respect for pluralism, and that we can kind of, I think, seize upon and say, we need to have a social safety net. We need to be able to offer love and support for all of our citizens.
The most frustrating part about it for me is that there have been very, very thoughtful evangelicals, and who have articulated an alternative vision for how to stay truly evangelical and live in a pluralistic democratic society and contribute to a democratic society in the way Catherine's just described. But the power of that Christian nationalist, Christian right playbook has been just extreme, and it's hard to break it.
So unfortunately, we have to wrap up. I saved the final question with the most upvotes for last, so we're giving the people what they want. This is the final question. It's coming from Eric. Are there any prominent Christian leaders who speak out against this movement of Christian nationalism? Have they had any impact? Have any of these leaders written books against the unchristian nature of this movement, or is it only academics who do that?
Yeah, there are a number. I think about the Red Letter Christians. I think about William J. Barber, Reverend William J. Barber, and others. They speak, they write, they have people who listen, but they haven't figured out how to seize the reins of political power, and Christian nationalists have.
I think there are, you mentioned, Katherine, a lot on the evangelical left. I think there's a lot of evangelical centrists and even those on the right who have spoken out about this. David French, conservative writer. He was at the National Review. He now has his own gig called the French Press at this website called the Dispatch. Michael Gerson from the Washington Post. Peter Weiner from the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which actually today has another piece in the Atlantic, kind of criticizing this. I'm out there myself. I probably don't count because I've been labeled an academic, but I try to have a public presence as well. But there's a lot of people out there who are trying to sort of do this work. But again, it's all about getting traction. And again, I often say that, I teach American history. I often say we don't cover Jerry Falwell Sr. and the moral majority enough, because that movement just had that movement is probably one of the most successful. I think Katherine might agree, one of the most successful political movements in sort of post World War II America. That's a historical statement, not a moral judgment or good or bad, but they have taught millions and millions and millions of white evangelicals mostly how to do politics. It's been an incredibly successful movement, and it's hard to beat.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, Catherine. This has been an incredible conversation. I want to make one last plug. If you enjoyed this conversation, please, please, please consider supporting the bookstore, supporting the authors, and purchase the books. You can use the link below, or you can go to our website at www.midtownscholar.com. Thanks again to John and Catherine. I'll give you guys the last word. Anything else you want to say?
Thank
Stay
you
safe.
so much for. This has been a fun experiment, and I hope it's the first of many for Midtown Scholar.
Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah.
All right, everyone, be safe, be well.